of children could miss out on treatment for other infectious diseases. I'm Lauren Taylor. This is Al Jazeera, live from London. Also coming up, New York's coronavirus lockdown is extended and the Democratic presidential primary is cancelled. A question of survival. Hundreds of textile workers return to work in Bangladesh despite a nationwide lockdown. And the Pakistan radio station that's broadcasting vital coronavirus information to some of the country's most isolated listeners. Vaccinations for other infectious diseases. The WHO says 21 countries are already reporting shortages of some vaccines.
Every year, more than 116 million infants are vaccinated, or 86% of all children born globally. But there are still more than 13 million children around the world who miss out on vaccination. We know that
the World Health Organization has warned that the coronavirus pandemic is far from over and that it could indirectly harm the lives of millions of children who are missing out on vital vaccinations for other infectious diseases. The WHO says 21 countries are already reporting shortages of some vaccines.
Every year, more than 116 million infants are vaccinated, or 86% of all children born globally. But there are still more than 13 million children around the world who miss out on vaccination. We know that the number will increase because of COVID-19. Already, polio vaccination campaigns have been put on hold, and in some countries, routine immunization services are being scaled back or shut down.
As European nations begin to ease their lockdowns, the WHO has repeated its call that they must track and trace all suspected coronavirus cases. The warning comes as Italy announced a phased reopening of its economy. But the UK says it's too soon to relax any measures. Emma Hayward takes a look at the situation across Europe.
Britain's Prime Minister back at work after recovering from coronavirus, with a warning that there will be no let-up in the lockdown yet.
I can see the long-term consequences of lockdown as clearly as anyone. And so, yes, I entirely share your urgency. It's the government's urgency. And yet we must also recognise the risk of a second spike.
More than 21,000 people have now died from coronavirus in UK hospitals in one of the world's worst outbreaks. The government has announced that the families of national health workers who've died from coronavirus during this crisis will receive a $75,000 payout. The number of tests being offered in the UK is being expanded, but the government has faced criticism for the slow rollout of mass testing, and there are growing frustrations and questions, even within Boris Johnson's own party, about how soon the economy can reopen. Italy has set a date to start easing its lockdown, the longest in Europe. Factories and building sites can reopen next week. Bars and restaurants can fully reopen in June, while schools will stay shut until September. Many parts of Europe are grappling with the impact of this crisis. There is anger in some of France's poorest suburbs. The lockdown and restrictions on movement in communities where people often live in cramped conditions has led to unrest. The police have been accused of being heavy-handed in their approach. Racial slurs were allegedly used to mock a man trying to escape arrest last week.
Macron said its own minorities, so it's difficult because people are suffering from this virus. They are suffering from the economic and social impacts.
There is optimism in some parts of Europe that the worst of this crisis may be over, but there's still no unified approach in how to keep safe going forward. In most parts of Germany, people will have to wear face masks in shops and on public transport. Elsewhere, some families are seeing one another for the first time in weeks, albeit through the glass, but together all the same. Emma Hayward, Al Jazeera.
Health experts in the UK are investigating possible links between a rare but dangerous condition affecting children and the coronavirus. Over the past few weeks, hospitals in London have reported a rising number of children with stomach pain, vomiting or diarrhoea. It's led some in what doctors call into a multi-system inflammatory state, requiring intensive care. Symptoms include inflammation of the heart. The country's health minister says he's very worried by possible links to the virus after some of the children tested positive. New York has become the first US state to cancel its Democratic presidential primary because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The vote, which had already been postponed, was meant to take place in June. Meanwhile, Governor Andrew Cuomo is set to extend the coronavirus lockdown in many parts of the state beyond May the 15th. But restrictions could be relaxed in some areas if there's sufficient tracing and hospital capacity. Cuomo also released the results of expanded testing, which suggests that almost 15% of the state carries antibodies to the coronavirus. Well, Christian Salumi is live for us from New York. So talk us through how it'll work, this lockdown being extended, but not everywhere.
Absolutely. Well, the governor says he is working on criteria to open up parts of the state, possibly after May 15th. Those shelter-at-home orders will stay in place at least until then. After that, he is going to be considering things like hospital capacity, testing capacity, tracing of active cases capacity, and so on a county-by-county basis. He says that it's likely the first sectors of the economy to reopen will be manufacturing and construction, but in areas that have not been highly affected by the virus. So parts of the state where there are fewer infections, fewer fatalities, will likely reopen sooner than places like here in New York City, where they have seen well over half of the 280,000 cases reported statewide. So he is talking about an opening that will be very cautious and very slow, considered on a county-by-county basis throughout the state, but also in coordination with neighboring states, because he says if one opens quicker than the other, that could send people running over state lines and so on and so forth. So it's only the very beginning of a plan, and it will not start until May 15th, but the beginning of a light at the end of the tunnel for people who are wondering how long this can and will continue.
And what about the primary being cancelled? Is that going to set a precedent that other states might copy?
Well, it's interesting. The reason they were able to do that here in New York is because of a little-known new state law that allows the Board of Elections to remove people from the state ballot who have essentially dropped out of the race. So on the Democratic side, Joe Biden is the only candidate officially in the race anymore. This allows them to remove those other candidates from the ballot. And the Board of Elections said, given that the situation is so uncertain in the state, even in June 23rd, where the primary had already been postponed from this month until June, they are worried that the health and safety of poll workers and voters would be too much of a risk for a result that is pretty much foregone, that Joe Biden will be the nominee. That said, the decision is not sitting well with supporters of Bernie Sanders. While he has officially dropped out of the race, he has been staying on ballots in an attempt to gain delegates and wield some influence at the Democratic National Convention come this summer. We've seen them tweeting and issuing statements. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the popular congresswoman, has spoken out that she's very against this decision. But there it is, the New York officially, for the first time in its history, canceling the Democratic primary for the presidential race.
Christian Salumi, thank you very much. The White House has cancelled its daily coronavirus briefing. It's the third straight day that President Trump has not addressed the media on the national COVID-19 response. Let's go live to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. So, Kimberly, even though the briefing is cancelled, we're still expecting to hear from President Trump, I gather.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a confusing day because at first we thought there was a briefing at 21 GMT, then we heard it was canceled. Now the latest guidance coming from the White House is that there will be a 21 GMT Rose Garden press conference, although I'm hearing it may be closer to 21:30 GMT. Now, what's going on here? Well, the U.S. president has been really reeling over the weekend, lashing out at the media in particular, and again today, over some of the criticism that he had a bit of a public relations disaster late last week when he suggested that it might be possible to get rid or eradicate COVID-19 from the human body if you injected disinfectant into the body or even shone a UV light. Well, the criticism has been continuing for days, and that led to a lot of soul searching among the White House on the president's messaging, whether it would be better to cut back on some of these briefings and whether or not it would be better just to have the president talking about the economy and restarting it versus some of the public health messages that have caused him so much trouble. So it appeared that that was where things were and on track, but then we saw the president sort of abruptly changing his mind, we assume, with this latest addition to the schedule. So we're watching that very carefully, whether or not the president will lash out against the media as he has already done on Twitter today. In fact, the president's saying fake news, enemy of the people. What this appears is that the president is trying to control the media narrative, one that has seemingly spiraled out of his control over the weekend. We do know that the president does feel comfortable talking about the economy, and certainly he's eager to restart it. We've seen some reopening all across the United States over the weekend. Colorado, the latest state today to have curbside retail. And we're also watching on that front for the president. In the next hour or so, he will be talking to retail industry leaders. We'll be carefully watching to see what he has to say there, but we think the real message and the focus of what the president wants to get out to the American public will be happening from the Rose Garden. But it is a big question mark what this is all about, given the conflicting messages coming out of this White House in the last 24 hours.
Kimberly Halkett, thank you very much indeed. More than 500 garment factories in Bangladesh have been allowed to reopen. It comes after hundreds of workers went back to work on Sunday in defiance of a month-long shutdown. They said they were facing starvation without their wages. Bangladesh fears it could lose around $6 billion in export revenue this financial year because of the shutdown. Tanvir Chowdhury has more from Dhaka. He says the conditions the workers labour and live in amount to a coronavirus time bomb.
The Prime Minister has a stimulus package of $588 million. Now, this was promised some time back. Many of the workers have been protesting for the last several days. Many haven't been paid for months. Some are on the brink of starvation. Now, they've been asked to join some of the factories. At least 1,000+ factories are opening all across the countries in a limited way because they're under pressure from international buyers to fulfill their obligation. Many buyers, on the other hand, have cancelled their order, resulting in billions of dollars of loss. Now, the factors' main concern for the garment workers are their safety and, of course, their salary, as you just mentioned. Now, the garments owner have assured they'll get paid and is guaranteed by the government. Now, I spoke to one of the activists and the leader for the garments workers. She said the main concern is safety and, of course, their salary as well. And because many of them work in closed compartment, 300, 400 workers in each floor, they live in a densely populated area, sometimes in slums. If an epidemic spread, it is a potential time bomb for the workers.
Plenty more still ahead on Al Jazeera, including a coronavirus opportunity for control. Is China using the crisis as a smokescreen for geopolitical ambitions?
Hello, it's been a very dry April so